Do you know which English king imprisoned his wife for 16 years? It was Henry II, the same king whose bitter power struggle with Archbishop Thomas Becket ended in Becket's murder in 1170. And this wasn't the only relationship Henry tried to control. Before that infamous episode became legend, he locked up his own wife for 16 years. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. You may have heard of her. She was one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. She married a king, divorced him, married another king, ruled vast territories, went on crusade, and later spent over a decade in confinement for supporting a rebellion against her husband. Henry and Eleanor were the medieval power couple. When they married in 1152, she was about 30, wealthy, experienced, and already twice crowned queen. He was 19, ambitious, energetic, and heir to an expanding empire. Their marriage took place just 8 weeks after Eleanor's marriage to King Louis VII of France was annulled. The speed of it raised eyebrows across Europe. With her came the vast Duchy of Aquitaine. That inheritance made Henry more powerful in France than the French king himself. In 1154, Henry became King of England. Together, Henry and Eleanor controlled territories stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. Historians later called it the Angevin Empire. They had 8 children who survived infancy. Among them were Richard I, later known as Richard the Lionheart, and John, who would become King John of England and who is widely regarded as one of the most cruel and incompetent monarchs in British history. At first, the marriage was politically brilliant. Personally, it became increasingly strained. Henry was intensely driven and deeply controlling. Eleanor had ruled Aquitaine in her own right and had no intention of becoming a decorative queen. Henry also had multiple mistresses. The most famous was Rosamund Clifford, often romanticised as Fair Rosamund. Later legends claimed Eleanor tried to poison her in a labyrinth, but there is no solid evidence for that story. By the late 1160s, Eleanor spent more time in Aquitaine, governing her lands. Tensions between the couple escalated. Then, in 1173, everything broke. Henry's sons were frustrated. Although he granted them titles, he refused to give them real authority. The young King Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey rebelled against their father in what became known as the Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174. Eleanor supported her sons and attempted to join them. She was captured while trying to leave Aquitaine, reportedly disguised as a man. The rebellion failed. Henry crushed it. He eventually reconciled with his sons. Eleanor was not so fortunate. From 1173 until 1189, she was kept under guard. It was not a dungeon imprisonment. She was held in various royal castles and lived in relative comfort, with attendants and proper accommodations. But she was not free. She could not travel independently or exercise real political power. She was occasionally brought to court for ceremonial events, then returned to confinement. 16 years. Then, in 1189, Henry II died after a final conflict with his sons. His surviving son Richard became king. Richard's first official act was to release his mother. Eleanor, now in her mid-60s, did not retire quietly. While Richard left on the Third Crusade, she effectively governed England in his absence. She kept the kingdom running and negotiated crucial alliances. When Richard was captured in 1192 by Duke Leopold of Austria and transferred to Emperor Henry VI, it was Eleanor who organised the effort to raise the staggering ransom that secured his freedom. Even in her later years, she travelled across Europe arranging marriages and securing political alliances. She eventually retired to Fontevraud Abbey, where she died in 1204, likely in her early 80s, an extraordinary age for the 12th century. Now, who was Henry II? He was the first Plantagenet King of England and one of the most capable medieval rulers. He reformed the English legal system, strengthened royal justice, expanded administrative structures, and consolidated power across his domains. His legal reforms laid foundations for the English common law tradition. But he was also volatile, controlling, and perpetually at war, with France, with his sons, and at times with his own wife. His marriage to Eleanor was not a simple tale of villain and victim. It was a political partnership between two exceptionally strong personalities. There were genuine tensions, betrayals, and power struggles. Their surviving correspondence suggests complexity, not simply hatred, but frustration and mutual ambition. History often centres on kings and battles, yet Eleanor of Aquitaine's life reminds us that power in the Middle Ages was not limited to men with swords. She lost years of freedom, but she did not disappear from history. She outlived Henry, influenced two kings, and left a political legacy that shaped England and France for generations. Henry II imprisoned his wife for 16 years. But Eleanor of Aquitaine remains one of the most formidable figures of the 12th century, not because she was locked away, but because she returned to power and used it. Do you know which English king's corpse famously burst during burial because it didn't fit the tomb? William I. Yes, William the Conqueror, crowned in 1066, died in 1087, buried very messily. This isn't just trivia, it's one of the most grotesque episodes in royal history. A bloated, decomposing body, a too small stone tomb, and a funeral that turned into a medieval disaster. William was born around 1027 to 1028, the illegitimate son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and Herleva, also called Arlette, a woman from Falaise. People did not let him forget his illegitimacy. He earned the nickname William the Bastard long before he became the Conqueror. But he survived. He fought rivals, crushed rebellions, and secured Normandy with ruthless efficiency. Then came 1066. When Edward the Confessor died childless, William claimed the English throne. He crossed the Channel, fought the Battle of Hastings, and defeated Harold Godwinson. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066. The next 2 decades were spent consolidating power, castles, taxation, reordering the English aristocracy, and brutal campaigns, especially in the north. His harrying of the north was devastating and is still remembered as one of the harshest episodes of Norman rule. By the 1080s, William was older, worn down, and according to chroniclers, increasingly overweight. His enemies mocked him for it. King Philip I of France reportedly joked about William being like a pregnant woman, a taunt William did not appreciate. In 1087, William was campaigning in Normandy against the French in the region of the Vexin. During the sack of the town of Mantes, his horse stumbled amid debris. William was thrown forward, struck the pommel of his saddle, and suffered severe internal injuries. He was taken to Rouen. Over the following weeks, he deteriorated. Chroniclers describe his suffering in vivid detail. He made final arrangements, issued grants, worried about his son's inheritance, and prepared for death. William died on September 9th, 1087. Now comes the burial. William had founded the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, often called the Abbaye aux Hommes, and intended to be buried there. It should have been a grand, controlled Norman show of power. Instead, the aftermath was chaos. According to medieval accounts, after William died, many nobles and officials quickly left. His household fell apart. The body was not treated with the kind of careful embalming we imagine from later eras. Time passed. The weather was warm. Decomposition did what decomposition does. Eventually, the funeral proceeded at Caen, but there was a problem. The stone tomb prepared for him was too small. As the monks and attendants tried to force the body into the sarcophagus, the swollen corpse reportedly ruptured. Chroniclers describe the abdomen bursting and a horrific stench filling the church. Mourners recoiled. The ceremony was disrupted. Priests pushed through the service as best they could. A royal funeral became an endurance test. It's grotesque, but also oddly fitting as a reminder of the medieval world. Even the most feared ruler in Western Europe could not escape the basic realities of death. William's legacy, of course, was immense. He transformed England's ruling class, tied England more tightly to continental politics, and ordered the great survey we now call the Domesday Book, compiled in 1086. He was a formidable administrator and a violent conqueror. But he also left behind a dynasty full of conflict. Robert Curthose, the eldest, received Normandy. William II, Rufus, received England. Henry, the youngest, initially received money, and later took the crown as Henry I, eventually securing Normandy as well. So, yes, William the Conqueror changed English history forever. And then, at the end, his body didn't even fit the tomb. Powerful in life, uncontainable in death. Do you know which English king became a best-selling author? James I. Yes, the same James who united the crowns of England and Scotland. The same James who survived the Gunpowder Plot. The same James who simply could not stop writing. He was a king with a pen, and he used it constantly. James was born in 1566 and became King of Scotland in 1567 as James VI, after his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate. He was just 13 months old. In 1603, after Elizabeth I died childless, he inherited the English throne and became James I of England. This event is known as the Union of the Crowns. One monarch ruled both kingdoms, though they remained legally separate states. It was a political balancing act from the start, but governing wasn't James's only obsession. He wrote obsessively. Political theory, religious tracts, advice manuals, speeches, poetry. While other monarchs hunted or staged tournaments, James argued theology on paper. He genuinely saw himself as an intellectual ruler, and people read him. One of his most notorious works was Daemonology, published in 1597 while he was still King of Scotland. It was a serious treatise on witchcraft, structured as a dialogue. James had become personally invested in the subject after storms disrupted his voyage home from Denmark with his new bride, Anne of Denmark. He became convinced that witches had conjured the storms against him. Demonology argued that witchcraft was real, satanic, and a threat to Christian society. The book reinforced witch-hunting policies in Scotland and supported the wider European climate of witch persecution. It was not fantasy. It was royal policy in print. Another major work was Basilicon Doron, written in 1599 for his eldest son, Henry Frederick. The title means royal gift. It was meant to be private guidance on kingship, advice on ruling, religion, and royal conduct. But the manuscript was leaked and quickly published. It became widely read. In it, James outlined his belief in the divine right of kings. He instructed his son to rule justly but firmly, to uphold Protestantism, and to treat Parliament cautiously. It was part instruction manual, part political philosophy, and part self-portrait. When James became King of England in 1603, the book was republished for an English audience and gained even more attention. He also wrote The True Law of Free Monarchies, 1598, a direct defense of absolute monarchy. In it, James argued that kings derived authority from God, not from Parliament. This idea would later fuel tensions between the Stuart monarchy and Parliament, especially under his son, Charles I. James wrote passionately about religion. He saw himself as a theologian king. He debated predestination, church governance, and religious conformity. He opposed Catholic political influence, but also resisted extreme Puritan reformers. He believed in a unified national church under royal authority. Then there is the most famous book associated with his reign, the King James Bible. James did not write it, but in 1604 he authorized a new English translation of the Bible, partly to resolve religious disputes. The result, completed in 1611, became one of the most influential works in the English language. While he earned no royalties, his name became permanently attached to it. James understood the power of print. His writings were not casual. They were part of how he shaped his image. He was not a battlefield hero like Henry V, nor a carefully curated icon like Elizabeth I. He presented himself instead as a learned, divinely appointed ruler, thoughtful, scholarly, and authoritative. His style could be dense. He quoted scripture and classical authors freely. He enjoyed argument. Sometimes he sounded profound. Sometimes he sounded defensive. Often he sounded very sure of himself. He also wrote A Counterblast to Tobacco in 1604, a fierce attack on smoking. In it, he called tobacco a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain. It read less like legislation and more like an exasperated lecture. He later imposed heavy taxes on tobacco imports. By the time James died in 1625, he had ruled Scotland for nearly 58 years, and England for 22. His reign in England was relatively stable, though marked by ongoing financial strain and tension with Parliament. He left behind a substantial body of writing, something no previous English monarch had done on that scale. He was not merely a patron of literature. He was an active author whose works were widely circulated in his lifetime. Calling him a best-selling author is slightly modern shorthand, but in his own era, his books were printed, debated, and influential across Europe. James I ruled with ink as much as authority. He believed words could defend kingship, shape religion, and define power. Whether one agrees with his ideas or not, he remains the only British monarch who seriously competed in the marketplace of ideas and expected to win. Do you know which nation used powdered mouse brains in a toothpaste? If you think your minty fluoride toothpaste is unpleasant, imagine brushing with crushed mouse brains. It sounds like satire, but in the ancient Roman world, animal-based remedies did sometimes make their way into medical and cosmetic treatments, including those for teeth. The Romans cared deeply about appearance. Clean white togas, well-groomed hair, scented oils, and healthy-looking teeth all signaled status and self-respect. A bright smile mattered. Elite Romans, in particular, invested time and money in personal grooming. But there was no toothpaste aisle. Roman dental care was a mixture of practical hygiene, medical theory, and folk belief. Roman tooth powders often included abrasive ingredients such as crushed pumice stone, charcoal, powdered oyster shells, burnt eggshells, or ground bones. These substances helped scrub stains from enamel. Some were mixed with vinegar, honey, or herbs for flavour and supposed medicinal benefit. To clean their teeth, Romans used frayed wooden sticks, cloths, and chew sticks, twigs softened at one end to act like bristles. Toothpicks, often made of bone or wood, were common and sometimes carried as personal accessories. Now to the mice. Ancient medical texts do record the use of ground mouse parts in remedies. Pliny the Elder, in his encyclopedic work Natural History, lists numerous treatments involving animals, including mice, for various ailments. Mouse ash, ground mouse bodies, and other parts were used in folk medicine for earaches, skin conditions, and other complaints. There are references in ancient sources to animal-based substances, including mouse-derived materials, being used for dental pain or oral conditions. However, the idea of a widespread mouse brain toothpaste is likely an exaggeration. It would have been part of fringe or folk remedies rather than standard Roman hygiene practice. The reasoning behind such ingredients reflects how ancient medicine worked. Roman medical thought blended observation, inherited Greek theory, and sympathetic magic. If an animal was seen as hardy or resilient, its body parts might be thought to transfer those qualities. Organs were believed to contain concentrated essence or power. Mice were common and easy to obtain. In a culture where animal ash and powdered horn were already used medicinally, adding mouse components did not seem absurd. More firmly documented is another Roman dental practice: urine. Human urine, especially imported from Spain, was used as a cleaning agent. The reason is chemical. Urine contains ammonia, which can act as a whitening and disinfecting substance. The poet Catullus, writing in the 1st century BCE, mocks a man for having dazzling white teeth, suggesting he rinses them with Spanish urine. It was considered effective, if unpleasant. Did any of this work? Abrasive powders like pumice and charcoal likely did remove surface stains. Vinegar has mild antibacterial properties but can erode enamel. Ammonia from urine would have had a whitening effect. As for mouse brains, there is no modern scientific evidence that they provided any dental benefit. Their use would have reflected symbolic or traditional reasoning rather than chemistry. It is also important to remember that Roman medicine was not uniform. Educated physicians like Galen attempted to systematize medical theory using the humoral model inherited from Greece. At the same time, everyday people relied on household remedies passed down through generations. Dental care was not purely medical, it was social. Missing or decayed teeth were associated with aging, illness, and lower status. In Roman society, outward appearance reflected inner virtue. Maintaining white teeth was part of presenting oneself as disciplined and respectable. Wealthier Romans could afford imported spices such as cinnamon or clove to mask unpleasant smells. Tooth powders were sold in markets, typically made from chalk, charcoal, salt, or crushed shells. Some likely included more imaginative ingredients depending on the seller. So, did Romans really use powdered mouse brains? There is historical evidence that mouse-derived substances appeared in ancient remedies, including treatments related to the mouth. But it was not standard toothpaste in the modern sense. It was part of a broader world of experimental, symbolic, and sometimes deeply strange ancient medicine. The bigger lesson is simple. Dental vanity is not modern. For over 2,000 years, people have gone to surprising lengths to keep their teeth white. The Romans gave us roads, aqueducts, and concrete. They also gave us the occasional reminder that history can be impressive and at times deeply unappealing. Next time you complain about toothpaste, remember that somewhere in the 1st century, someone may well have been grinding up animal parts in the name of oral hygiene, and thinking it was perfectly reasonable. Do you know which English king was killed by a young man seeking revenge? Richard, the Lionheart. Yes, the poster boy for crusades and chivalric legend. The warrior king who became a symbol of medieval heroism did not die in a glorious battlefield charge. He died outside a small obscure French castle because a young defender fired a crossbow. Richard I ruled England from 1189 to 1199. He spoke French as his first language, spent only about 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, and treated kingship largely as a way to fund his military campaigns. He was Duke of Aquitaine long before he was King of England, and his continental lands mattered deeply to him. England was, in many ways, a source of revenue. Chroniclers described him as physically impressive and formidable in battle. He earned the nickname Lionheart during the Third Crusade, where he fought against Saladin. He gained admiration for his military skill, but the crusade did not succeed in retaking Jerusalem. It did, however, cement his reputation as a warrior. On his way home, Richard was captured in 1192 near Vienna by Duke Leopold V of Austria, who had old grievances against him. He was handed over to Emperor Henry VI and held for ransom. The sum demanded was enormous. England was heavily taxed to secure his release. Once freed, Richard returned to what he preferred most: war in France. In 1199, he was suppressing a rebellion in the Limousin region. A minor noble, often identified as Aymar of Limoges, was accused of withholding treasure reportedly found on his lands. Richard marched to besiege the small castle of Chalus-Chabrol. It was not a major fortress, it was barely strategic, but Richard was determined. During the siege, as he inspected the defences, reportedly without full armour, he was struck by a crossbow bolt in the shoulder. The shooter is traditionally identified as a young man named Bertrand de Gourdon, though some later sources give the name Pierre Basile. The exact identity remains uncertain. The wound itself was not immediately fatal. However, it became infected. Medieval surgery could remove the bolt, but not prevent infection effectively. Gangrene set in. Richard died on April 6, 1199. According to several chroniclers, he forgave the young crossbowman before he died and ordered that he be spared. However, After Richard's death, the mercenary commander Mercadier allegedly had the youth flayed and hanged. As with many medieval accounts, details vary, but the tradition of forgiveness followed by brutal revenge is widely repeated. The irony is striking. Richard survived major battles during the Third Crusade. He survived captivity. He survived political betrayal. Yet he died from a wound inflicted during a minor siege by a young defender on a castle wall. Richard's legacy is complicated. He is often romanticized as the ideal Crusader king. In reality, he was a relentless and sometimes ruthless war leader. At Acre, in 1191, he ordered the execution of thousands of Muslim prisoners when negotiations stalled. He taxed his kingdom heavily. He delegated governance in England largely to ministers, most notably William Longchamp and later Hubert Walter. His relationship with his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was politically significant. Even in her later years, she worked to secure alliances and stability for her sons. Richard relied on experienced administrators to manage England while he campaigned abroad. He married Berengaria of Navarre, but their marriage produced no children. Upon his death, he named his younger brother John as his heir. That decision had lasting consequences. John would lose much of the Angevin Empire in France and face rebellion at home, ultimately sealing Magna Carta in 1215. Richard's death marked the beginning of the rapid decline of English royal power in France. As for his burial, his body was divided according to custom. His main body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in France, alongside his father Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His heart was buried in Rouen, the capital of Normandy. His entrails were buried at Chalus, near the place where he died. Richard became legend. The young crossbowman became a shadowy footnote in history. Whether his name was Bertrand de Gourdon or something else entirely, he changed the course of English and French history with a single bolt. One of the most famous warrior kings of the Middle Ages was not defeated by an army. He was felled by infection, and by a young man on a castle wall who took his shot. Do you know which king wrote spicy love letters to his lover and had them end up in the Vatican? I mean the letters, obviously, not the lover. If you've ever sent a dramatic message and prayed it would disappear, spare a thought for Henry VIII. His passionate letters to Anne Boleyn didn't just survive. They ended up preserved in the Vatican Apostolic Archives. Yes, that Vatican. The one with miles of shelving and centuries of carefully guarded documents. 17 surviving love letters written by Henry between 1527 and 1528 are still held there. They are emotional, intense, occasionally dramatic, and unmistakably infatuated. They read less like cold political manoeuvring and more like a man completely obsessed. So how did England's king's love letters end up in Rome? By the mid-1520s, Henry VIII had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years. She had given birth to several children, but only one survived infancy, Mary. Henry wanted a legitimate male heir. He became convinced that his marriage was cursed because Catherine had previously been married to his brother. Enter Anne Boleyn. Anne had spent years at the French court and returned to England polished, educated, and politically aware. She refused to become Henry's mistress. If he wanted her, he had to marry her. That meant obtaining an annulment from the Pope. Between 1527 and 1528, while Henry was pursuing that annulment, he wrote to Anne frequently. In the letters, he calls her "my mistress and friend," declares his devotion, and expresses frustration at being apart from her. In one, he writes that he would rather be in her arms than anywhere else. The tone is urgent and deeply personal. At this point, Henry was still officially married. The Pope at the time was Clement VII. Clement VII was in a difficult political position. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose troops had recently sacked Rome in 1527. Granting Henry an annulment would have angered one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. So, the Pope stalled. As for the letters, historians believe they were likely intercepted or sent to Rome as part of the legal and diplomatic proceedings surrounding Henry's request for annulment. They may have been included in documentation intended to demonstrate the seriousness of Henry's intentions. They were not stolen in a cloak and dagger romance plot, but they did become part of the Vatican's official archival record. The archive where they are stored is now called the Vatican Apostolic Archives. It was formerly known as the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. Secretum in this context meant private, not mysterious, though that hasn't stopped the myths. The archive holds many kilometres of shelving, not merely meters, and access is limited to qualified scholars. The letters were catalogued centuries later and eventually published in facsimile, allowing historians to study them. What do they reveal? First, Henry was genuinely smitten. He expresses longing, impatience, and a strong desire for Anne's affection. This was not a casual flirtation. He spent years pursuing her. Second, Anne held significant power during this period. She managed to keep the king waiting. For roughly 6 years, Henry pursued annulment, reshaped English religious authority, and ultimately broke from Rome. In 1533, Henry married Anne after secretly wedding her earlier that year. Their daughter Elizabeth was born soon after. But the story did not end in romance. In 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Most modern historians consider the charges fabricated or politically motivated. She was executed in May 1536. Henry would go on to marry 4 more times. The consequences of his pursuit of Anne were enormous. His break with Rome led to the English Reformation, the establishment of the Church of England, and decades of religious upheaval. As for the letters, they remain one of the most intimate glimpses into Henry's personality before the later paranoia and brutality of his reign became dominant. They show a king who could be ardent, impatient, romantic, and intensely focused on one woman. There is a sharp irony in the fact that these deeply personal letters are preserved in the very institution Henry eventually rejected. They sit in Rome, carefully catalogued, read by historians, and occasionally displayed in published collections. Not secret love notes in a drawer, but diplomatic artifacts of one of the most consequential romances in European history. So yes, Henry VIII wrote passionate letters to Anne Boleyn, and centuries later they are still there, resting in the Vatican's archives, a reminder that even kings can lose their heads over love. And so can queens. Do you know which empire used a building material that even contemporary science struggles to replicate? The Roman Empire, obviously. Picture Emperor Hadrian inspecting his newly ordered frontier barrier in Britain, Hadrian's Wall, stretching across northern England. Its purpose was not simply to keep out angry Scots. Scotland as a political entity did not yet exist, but to control movement, trade, and military security at the edge of Roman Britain. Elsewhere in the empire, Roman engineers were pouring concrete into wooden moulds to build harbours, aqueducts, bath complexes, temples, and apartment blocks. Fast forward nearly 2,000 years, some of those structures are still standing. Meanwhile, your local parking garage might crack within decades. Welcome to the durability of Roman concrete. To be clear, the Romans did not invent concrete. Earlier civilizations, including the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, used lime-based mortars, but the Romans refined and systematized a form of hydraulic concrete that was revolutionary. They called it opus caementitium. It became the backbone of Roman architecture. The Pantheon, the Colosseum, vast bath complexes, aqueduct systems, and especially maritime harbours. So, what made it different? Modern concrete typically uses Portland cement mixed with sand, gravel, and water. Roman concrete used a mixture of lime, calcium oxide, water, and volcanic ash, known as pozzolana, along with pieces of stone or brick. The volcanic ash was key. Much of it came from the region around the Bay of Naples, particularly near Mount Vesuvius. When lime and pozzolana were mixed with water, they triggered a chemical reaction that formed strong, durable bonding compounds. Importantly, this mixture could set underwater. That made it ideal for harbours and coastal construction. And here's the part that fascinates modern scientists. Roman marine concrete often grew stronger over time. Seawater interacting with the volcanic materials led to the formation of rare crystalline minerals, including aluminous tubermarite and philipsite. These crystals reinforced the structure internally as it aged. Instead of slowly breaking down, the material chemically evolved. That does not mean Roman concrete was magic or indestructible, but in certain marine environments, it proved extraordinarily resilient. One of the most famous surviving examples is the Pantheon in Rome, completed around 126 AD during Hadrian's reign. It still boasts the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. The Romans achieved this by carefully varying the concrete mix, using heavier materials at the base and lighter volcanic aggregates toward the top to reduce weight. It was engineering, not sorcery. Roman builders typically mixed lime and pozzolana, sometimes using hot mixing techniques, then packed the mixture around stone aggregate inside wooden forms. In marine settings, they often used seawater directly. Modern studies suggest that the way they heated and combined lime may have created lime clasts that later contributed to crack healing behaviour. In the 2010s and early 2020s, researchers using advanced imaging techniques examined ancient samples in detail. In 2023, a team from MIT published research suggesting that Roman hot mixing methods produced materials capable of self-healing small cracks when exposed to water. By replicating similar conditions, they demonstrated improved durability in modern test materials. That does not mean we are incapable of reproducing Roman concrete. It means that for a long time we misunderstood some aspects of how it worked. Modern concrete, particularly reinforced concrete with steel rebar, is optimized for different structural demands. It performs well under tension and compression and allows for skyscrapers and long-span bridges. Roman concrete excelled in compression, which made it perfect for arches, vaults and domes, but less suitable for beam-heavy structures. It is also important to acknowledge labour. Much Roman construction relied on soldiers, labourers, and enslaved people who did the quarrying, hauling, mixing, and building. The durability of Roman architecture came at a significant human cost. So why not simply switch back to Roman-style concrete today? Part of the challenge is material sourcing. The specific volcanic ash used in ancient Italy is not available everywhere. Modern construction standards also prioritize speed, uniformity, and compatibility with steel reinforcement. Roman marine concrete took time to cure and was tailored to specific environments. Still, there is growing interest in adapting ancient techniques to improve sustainability. Modern cement production is a major contributor to carbon emissions. If lessons from Roman formulations can reduce environmental impact and increase longevity, engineers are eager to learn from them. The takeaway is not that the Romans possessed lost supernatural knowledge. It's that they combined available natural materials with careful observation, experimentation, and large-scale organisation. Their concrete was designed for durability in specific conditions, especially marine ones, and in those environments it outperformed many modern equivalents. Next time you stand under the dome of the Pantheon or walk along the remnants of a Roman harbour, remember, that structure has survived emperors, invasions, earthquakes, and millennia of weather. Not because it was mystical, because it was very, very well made. Do you know which English king's disappearance remains a mystery to this day? Edward V. The boy king who reigned for just over 2 months was placed in the Tower of London and then vanished. No trial, no confirmed burial at the time, no official explanation. Just silence, rumour, and an empty crown. This is one of England's greatest royal cold cases. Edward V was born in 1470 to King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville during the Wars of the Roses, the dynastic struggle between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, his 12-year-old son became king in theory, but he was still a child and not yet in London. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector until the boy came of age. Richard intercepted Edward on his journey to London and took custody of him, claiming he was ensuring stability during the transition. Edward was escorted to the Tower of London. At the time, the Tower was not only a prison, it was also a royal residence and the traditional lodging place for monarchs before their coronation. Initially, this did not appear alarming. Soon, Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, joined him there. Then everything shifted. In June 1483, a cleric named Robert Stillington claimed that Edward IV had previously contracted a marriage to another woman before marrying Elizabeth Woodville. If true, that would render Edward IV's marriage invalid and his children illegitimate. Parliament passed an act known as Titulus Regius, declaring Edward V and his siblings illegitimate. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, accepted the crown. He became King Richard III. The two boys were never seen in public again. There were early reports of them playing within the Tower grounds. Then the sightings stopped. Rumours began almost immediately. Some claimed they were smothered in their beds. Others said they were quietly murdered and buried within the tower. No contemporary confession survives. No official record of their deaths exists. Their disappearance became political dynamite. In 1485, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field and became Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. He married Edward V's sister, Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses and strengthening his claim to the throne. If the princes were alive, Henry's position would have been threatened. If they were dead, Richard bore the suspicion. Either way, reopening the question was dangerous. In the 1490s, a pretender named Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince. He gained some foreign support, but was eventually captured and executed. Most historians consider him an impostor, though at the time his claim was taken seriously enough to worry Henry VII. In 1674, during renovations at the Tower of London, workmen discovered a wooden box containing 2 small skeletons buried beneath a staircase in the White Tower. They were presumed to be the princes and were reinterred in Westminster Abbey. In 1933, the bones were examined, but the analysis was limited by the science of the time. Modern requests for DNA testing have so far been declined. The remains stay undisturbed. As for responsibility, suspicion has traditionally fallen on Richard III. William Shakespeare famously portrayed him as a deformed, ruthless villain in his play Richard III. But Shakespeare wrote during the Tudor era, when portraying Richard negatively aligned with the ruling dynasty's interests. Modern historians are more cautious. Richard III certainly benefited from the prince's disappearance, but so did Henry VII. Others in the political sphere could also have acted independently. There is no definitive proof tying the crime to any one person. Edward V reigned for approximately 78 days in 1483. He was never crowned and never ruled independently. He likely died at 12 or 13 years old. He remains the only English monarch whose ultimate fate is unknown. The Tower of London still stands. The alleged burial site beneath the staircase still draws attention. The bones in Westminster Abbey remain sealed. What happened to the princes in the tower is still debated. Were they murdered on their uncle's orders? Eliminated later under Henry VII? Did they die of illness and were quietly buried? Or is there some truth buried deeper still? We may never know. Edward V's reign lasted mere weeks. The mystery of his disappearance has lasted more than 5 centuries. Do you know in which nation it was popular for women to wear fake beards? When we picture ancient Egypt, we imagine pyramids, golden tombs, dramatic eyeliner, and statues of pharaohs, arms crossed, faces calm, and wearing those distinctive ceremonial beards. But here's the twist. Some of those bearded rulers were women, and the beards, completely artificial. Welcome to one of the most striking pieces of political symbolism in the ancient world. Female pharaohs wearing the false beard of kingship. Let's start with the most famous example, Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut ruled during the 18th dynasty from about 1479 to 1458 BCE. Initially, she served as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. But instead of quietly stepping aside, she declared herself pharaoh. Not queen, not regent, king. In ancient Egypt, kingship was deeply symbolic. Power was communicated visually. The crook and flail, the Nemes headdress, the uraeus cobra, the kilt, every detail carried meaning, and the ceremonial beard was one of the most important symbols of all. The false beard linked the pharaoh to Osiris, god of the afterlife, who was traditionally depicted with a long, narrow, often curved beard. It was not about masculinity in the modern sense, it was about divine authority. So, when Hatshepsut claimed the throne, she adopted the full visual language of kingship. Early in her reign, she was sometimes depicted in traditional female dress, but as her rule solidified, her statues and reliefs increasingly portrayed her in male regalia, bare-chested, wearing the kilt, broad-shouldered in artistic style, and crowned with the false beard. Her royal titles were written in masculine grammatical form. This was not an attempt to hide her identity. Egyptian art was symbolic, not realistic. Her subjects would have known perfectly well that she was female. The imagery communicated that she occupied the role of king, which was culturally coded as male. And it worked. Hatshepsut's reign was stable and prosperous. She oversaw major building projects, including her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which still stands today. She sponsored a celebrated trade expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back incense, exotic goods, and even live trees for transplanting in Egypt. The false beard she wore was carefully constructed, likely made of metal or tightly woven fibers, and secured with straps. There were stylistic differences. Straight beards were associated with living kings, while curved ones were linked to divine or deceased figures. Even facial hair had theological nuance. Hatshepsut was not the only female ruler in Egyptian history. Sobekneferu, who ruled at the end of the 12th dynasty around 1800 BCE, is considered the first woman to take the full royal titulary of king. Evidence suggests she also blended female and male royal imagery in her depictions, though far fewer statues survive. Later, Cleopatra VII, yes, the famous Cleopatra, did not wear a false beard in the traditional New Kingdom style. However, in certain reliefs and temple carvings, she was depicted performing rituals in the conventional pharaonic pose and dress, aligning herself visually with earlier kings. By her time, imagery had evolved, but the symbolic blending of gendered royal iconography remained part of the tradition. After Hatshepsut's death, many of her statues were defaced and her name removed from monuments. This likely occurred during the later reign of Thutmose III. For a long time, this was interpreted as personal revenge. Modern historians tend to see it more as political housekeeping. Egyptian kingship emphasized continuity and divine order. A woman ruling as king was unusual. Later rulers may have tried to restore a more traditional narrative of succession, but the erasure was incomplete. Archaeologists reconstructed her story from damaged statues, inscriptions, and temple reliefs. Today, Hatshepsut is recognized as one of ancient Egypt's most successful rulers. Her false beard has become a powerful symbol. It was not about pretending to be a man. It was about occupying an office that came with established visual rules. Rather than dismantle the system, she stepped into it fully, beard and all. So yes, in ancient Egypt, women who ruled as pharaohs sometimes wore fake beards, not as a joke, not as disguise, as a declaration, I am king. Do you know which nation created the first vending machine? When you think of vending machines, you probably picture that sad little corner in an office break room, the one with stale Pop-Tarts, Diet Coke, and a Snickers bar hanging on for dear life. But vending machines are older than you think. Much older. Like ancient Egypt old. The world's first known vending machine wasn't doling out chips or cold drinks, it dispensed holy water. And it was designed by a man whose job description basically read, professional genius. Meet Hero of Alexandria, also known as Heron of Alexandria, depending on how sassy your Latin teacher was. Hero wasn't actually Egyptian. He was a Greek engineer and mathematician who lived in Roman Egypt in the 1st century CE, most likely in Alexandria. Think of him as the Leonardo da Vinci of his time, minus the beard and with far more steam-powered gadgets. Hero was obsessed with automata, mechanical devices that could move or operate on their own. He created miniature theatres with moving puppets, a wind-powered organ, and even devices that we would now describe as programmable machines. But the crown jewel of his gadget collection was a coin-operated holy water dispenser. Here's how it worked. You walked up to a temple. You wanted to wash your hands or perform a ritual. You dropped a coin, usually a small bronze piece, into a slot at the top of a sealed container. The coin fell onto a small metal pan attached to a lever. The weight of the coin tipped the lever, opening a valve. Water poured out. Simple, yet genius. Once the coin slid off the pan, it dropped away. A counterweight then pulled the lever back up, closing the valve and stopping the flow of water. In other words, pay up, get water, just enough for your ritual ablutions, no holy water freeloaders allowed. This wasn't just a neat trick, it solved a real problem. Temples didn't want everyone grabbing at the holy water freely. Controlling access helped preserve its sanctity and encourage donations. It was, in a sense, divine automation. Hero described the machine in his book Pneumatica, a collection of designs that explained how to build ingenious devices using steam, air pressure, and mechanical principles. Most scholars believe he didn't invent every device himself. He likely documented and refined earlier Hellenistic engineering traditions. But he gets much of the credit because he wrote it all down. And that's a lesson for you. Document your work. Now pause for a second and think about this. 2,000 years ago, you could walk up to a temple in Alexandria, drop a coin into a machine, and receive a measured pour of holy water. That's not just functional. It feels borderline science fiction. And then, for the most part, history forgot about it. Hero's designs were so far ahead of their time that many were lost or ignored for centuries. Europe rediscovered his writings during the Renaissance, where they were admired more as curiosities than practical manuals. It wasn't until the 19th century that vending machines made a real comeback. One of the first modern vending machines was introduced in 1883 by Percival Everett in the United Kingdom. It dispensed postcards. Soon after came machines for chewing gum, stamps, cigarettes, and eventually soda and snacks. Japan later turned vending into an art form, with machines selling everything from umbrellas to fresh eggs. But Hero was the prototype. The holy water vending machine reminds us of something important. Ancient civilizations weren't just stacking stones and chanting prayers. They were experimenting, innovating, building mechanical systems we often assume are purely modern. and Hero wasn't alone. The Greeks and Romans built steam-powered toys, automatic doors for temples, and even coin-operated musical devices. The line between magic and mechanics was thin. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were showcases for technology designed to impress, inspire, and maybe intimidate. So, next time you tap your card on a coffee vending machine and it jams, think of Hero's bronze coin dropper in Alexandria, quietly dispensing blessings without Wi-Fi, electricity, or complaint. Do you know which English king owned a polar bear? Henry III. That's right. The man kept a polar bear in London in the 1200s, because why not? Let's start with the bear. Not a metaphorical bear, a real, live, terrifying, giant Arctic polar bear. And not in a zoo, because zoos weren't really a thing yet. This bear lived at the Tower of London, housed in the Royal Menagerie alongside lions, and sometimes they let it go swimming in the Thames. Yes, the Thames. We know this thanks to medieval expense records, because someone had to file a royal receipt for, and I quote, a muzzle and chain for the white bear, and a rope to allow it to fish in the river. This wasn't even the weirdest animal in Henry III's collection. But we'll get there. Henry III reigned from 1216 to 1272. That's 56 years. One of the longest reigns in medieval English history. He came to the throne at just 9 years old after his father, King John, yes, that King John, the Magna Carta one, died in the middle of a civil war. So baby Henry became king not because anyone thought he'd be brilliant, but because he was the legitimate heir and there wasn't a better option. In a shocking twist, a child king did not immediately stabilise the kingdom. England staggered through years of baronial unrest and political tension, though the French invasion ended fairly quickly in 1217. During Henry's minority, powerful regents like William Marshal did the real governing. Eventually, Henry grew up, took the reins of power, and seemed to decide, you know what this country needs? A Gothic cathedral and a pet polar bear. The polar bear was a diplomatic gift from King Haakon IV of Norway in 1252, a very medieval way of saying, we come in peace. Please accept this enormous carnivore. Henry had it kept at the tower and allowed it to fish in the Thames while secured by a long rope. Londoners must have had questions. But wait, there's more. Henry's menagerie also included lions, often called leopards in medieval heraldry, an African elephant gifted by King Louis IX of France in 1255, and various other exotic creatures. The elephant caused such a stir that chroniclers described it carefully as a great beast with a long nose. Fair enough. There were also camels, lynxes, porcupines, and various birds of prey. The tower wasn't just a fortress, it was a royal showcase. Henry III was not your classic warrior king. He wasn't particularly successful in military campaigns, and he had little interest in aggressive expansion. Instead, he loved architecture, religious ceremony, and artistic display. He was deeply devoted to Edward the Confessor, the pre-conquest king later canonised as a saint. Henry rebuilt Westminster Abbey in lavish Gothic style, beginning in 1245, spending enormous sums at a time when royal finances were strained. Priorities. He even named his eldest son Edward, reviving an old Anglo-Saxon royal name that had fallen out of use since the Norman conquest. That son would later become Edward I. Henry's devotion to Edward the Confessor was genuine. He promoted the saint's cult and moved his remains to a magnificent new shrine in Westminster Abbey. It was part piety, part political symbolism, but piety didn't solve England's financial problems. Henry borrowed heavily to fund building projects and support his extended family, especially his foreign relatives from Poitou and Savoy. He appointed some of them to powerful positions, which angered English nobles. Then came his ambitious and wildly impractical scheme to secure the kingdom of Sicily for his younger son. The papacy offered the crown, but the price was astronomical. Henry agreed anyway. The barons finally snapped. Led by Simon de Montfort, they forced Henry in 1258 to accept the provisions of Oxford, a set of reforms that limited royal authority and expanded baronial oversight. It was, in effect, a step toward constitutional government. Henry signed. Then he tried to undo it. Cue civil war. In 1264, Simon de Montfort defeated Henry at the Battle of Lewes and briefly took control of the government, but Henry's son Edward escaped, regrouped, and defeated de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, killing him and restoring royal authority. The crisis proved something important. Kings could not simply build cathedrals, collect exotic animals, and ignore political reality. Despite all this, Henry III wasn't a monster. He wasn't especially cruel or tyrannical. He was devout, earnest, and often well-meaning. He fasted. He prayed. He funded religious art. He genuinely believed he was ruling as a Christian king should. He just had very little sense of financial restraint and limited political instinct. He would spend a fortune on relics and building projects, then ask Parliament for more funds. He wanted to be a benevolent father to his people. His people mostly wanted him to balance the books, and through it all, the bear. When Henry died in 1272, the royal menagerie at the Tower continued. Later monarchs added to it, and over time it evolved into a long-running royal animal collection that lasted for centuries. The Tower menagerie operated in various forms until the 19th century, when the animals were eventually moved to what became the London Zoo. It's not clear how long the polar bear lived, or whether it ever caused serious harm, but the financial records show regular upkeep. This wasn't a passing novelty. Henry truly maintained it. If you're going to express royal power, a swimming Arctic predator is certainly one way to do it. The Tower of London menagerie lasted for more than 600 years. By the late medieval period, guidebooks even advised visitors not to tease the lions. Solid advice. So the next time you feel extravagant, just remember, Henry III put a polar bear in a castle, let it fish in the Thames, and thought, yes, this is governance. Do you know which cultures used ground-up mummies as medicine? If you think modern wellness trends get strange, wait until you hear this. For several centuries, people in the Middle East and Europe were grinding up mummies and swallowing the powder as medicine. Yes, actual mummies. Let's start at the beginning, because the story didn't begin with people raiding Egyptian tombs for snacks. The word mumia comes from Persian and Arabic. Originally, it didn't mean mummy at all. It referred to bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance found in the Middle East. Bitumen was valued in ancient medicine because it was sticky, preservative, and believed to help seal wounds and stop bleeding. When Islamic scholars encountered Egyptian mummies, they noticed the dark, resinous materials used in embalming. Those substances resembled bitumen. Over time, the word mumia expanded to include the preserved remains themselves. That linguistic shift had consequences. During the medieval period, especially after the Crusades increased contact between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, mumia entered European medical texts. Apothecaries began importing it. Physicians prescribed it. By the 12th and 13th centuries, powdered mummy was a recognized medicinal ingredient in parts of Europe. The logic made sense to them. In medieval European medicine, health was governed by the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness happened when those humours fell out of balance. Substances were categorized as hot, cold, dry, or moist, and treatments were chosen to restore equilibrium. Mumia was considered warm and dry. It was prescribed for internal bleeding, bruising, ulcers, headaches, and even epilepsy. Some believed that because mummies had been preserved for centuries, they contained a kind of concentrated life force. If something resisted decay, surely it had powerful properties. In practice, it did not. There may have been mild antiseptic effects from bitumen or resin, but consuming ground human remains did not cure disease in any meaningful way. Still, demand surged. By the Renaissance, mummy powder had become fashionable medicine across parts of Europe. It appeared in apothecary shops in Italy, France, England, and beyond. Even educated physicians recommended it. The problem was supply. There were only so many ancient Egyptian mummies to go around. As demand increased in the 16th and 17th centuries, a grim trade developed. Tombs were looted on a large scale. When genuine ancient remains became scarce, counterfeit mummy entered the market. Some reports suggest that recently deceased bodies were dried, treated, and sold as ancient Egyptian. Whether every rumour was true or not, fraud was widespread enough that medical writers began warning about fake mumia. By the 17th century, skepticism grew stronger. Advances in anatomy and chemistry began to undermine older medical theories. Physicians increasingly questioned whether consuming centuries-old remains made any scientific sense. Gradually, the practice declined. By the 18th century, mummy powder had largely fallen out of respectable medical use, surviving more as a curiosity than a serious treatment. So, what does this tell us? It shows how medicine evolves. People work with the knowledge they have. They draw conclusions from what seems logical at the time. If a substance preserves a body for 1,000 years, it must contain something powerful. That was the reasoning. It also shows how trade, language, and misunderstanding can shape medical history. A word that once meant bitumen slowly became ground human remains. And for centuries, no one stopped to reconsider the leap. Today, the idea sounds shocking. But in its time, it was mainstream. So the next time someone complains about herbal supplements or wellness fads, just remember, for hundreds of years, respected doctors prescribed powdered mummies with complete confidence. Do you know who had the shortest reign of any English monarch? Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. The teenage girl pulled onto the throne, used as a political chess piece, and executed before she ever had time to understand what ruling meant. She didn't fight for the crown. She didn't campaign for it, and it cost her everything. Lady Jane Grey was born in October 1537. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, which made her a great-niece of Henry VIII, and first cousin once removed to his children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. She was highly educated, even by royal standards, fluent in Latin and Greek, trained in theology, steeped in humanist scholarship, and fiercely Protestant. Scholars praised her intellect. She corresponded with leading reformers. She was serious, devout, and bookish. She was also 16 years old. When King Edward VI, the only legitimate son of Henry VIII, fell gravely ill in 1553, England faced a succession crisis. Edward was Protestant. His half-sister Mary, next in line under Henry VIII's will and the Act of Succession, was Catholic. Edward and his chief adviser, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, feared that Mary would reverse the Protestant Reformation in England, so they rewrote the succession. Edward drafted a document known as the Device for the Succession, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth on the grounds of illegitimacy and naming Lady Jane Grey and her male heirs as successors. Conveniently, Jane had just married Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley. It was a bold political gamble. Jane later claimed she was horrified when told she was to be queen. According to some accounts, she fainted. Whether that detail is dramatic embellishment or not, it's clear she had little real choice in the matter. On July 10th, 1553, after Edward's death, Jane was proclaimed Queen of England. There was no roaring celebration, no overwhelming public enthusiasm. She was taken to the Tower of London, as monarchs traditionally were before coronation. But the mood was uneasy. Meanwhile, Mary Tudor had not submitted quietly. She fled to East Anglia, gathered supporters, and issued her own claim to the throne. Crucially, many nobles and common people believed Mary was the legitimate heir under her father's will. Legitimacy mattered. Support for Mary snowballed. Even members of Jane's own Privy Council began to defect. On July 19th, just 9 days after Jane's proclamation, the council declared Mary Queen. Crowds in London cheered. Jane's reign was over almost before it began. She had never been crowned. She had issued no significant policy. She had ruled in name only. Jane and her husband Guildford Dudley were imprisoned in the Tower. At first, Mary I showed restraint. She understood that Jane had been manipulated. The real architect of the failed coup, Northumberland, was executed in August 1553. Jane, however, remained alive for a few months. Then came Wyatt's Rebellion in early 1554, a Protestant uprising sparked by opposition to Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. Although Jane had no direct involvement, rebels invoked her name as an alternative Protestant monarch. That made her dangerous. Reluctantly or not, Mary signed Jane's death warrant. On February 12th, 1554, Lady Jane Grey was led to the scaffold inside the Tower of London. She was 17 years old. Dressed in black, she carried a prayer book. She made a short speech, declaring that while she accepted her execution as lawful, she died a true Christian. She forgave her executioner. After blindfolding herself, she struggled briefly to find the execution block. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she reportedly said. Someone guided her hands. She knelt. The axe fell. Her husband, Guildford Dudley, had been executed earlier that morning on Tower Hill. Both were buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds, alongside other executed figures such as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Jane never ruled in any meaningful sense. Whether she should technically be counted as a reigning monarch is still debated by historians, but history remembers her as the shortest reigning claimant to the English throne. In death, her story grew larger. Protestant writers later portrayed her as a martyr. In the centuries that followed, painters romanticized her final moments. The 19th century, in particular, turned her into a symbol of innocence destroyed by ambition and political scheming. But strip away the legend, and what remains is stark. A teenager, exceptionally educated, deeply religious, caught between powerful men, dynastic anxiety, and religious upheaval in Tudor England. She never sought the crown. It was placed on her head for strategic reasons. When the strategy failed, she paid the price. 9 days as queen. A lifetime remembered. Did you know church bells and cannon fire were once used to fight the Black Death? When the Black Death tore through Europe in the 14th century, it didn't just kill people. It shattered the world as they understood it. Entire towns were emptied. Fields went unharvested. Priests died faster than they could bury the dead. In some cities, mortality rates reached 40 to 60%. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed tens of millions across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. And in the middle of all that horror, people reached for whatever tools they had. Sometimes that meant noise. Church bells rang constantly. Cannons were fired. Guns were discharged into the air. Drums were beaten. Crowds sang prayers at full volume. Why? Because people believed the plague travelled through corrupted air. This was the theory of miasma. Long before germ theory, many physicians believed disease spread through foul-smelling, poisonous vapours rising from swamps, rotting matter, or even moral corruption. If the air was bad, it made you sick. And if disease moved through air, perhaps you could disrupt it. Loud sounds were thought to shake, scatter, or purify contaminated air. The vibrations from massive church bells, some weighing several tons, were believed to cleanse the atmosphere. In certain regions, especially in parts of Italy and Germany, bells were rung for extended periods during outbreaks. Gunpowder was also used. In later plague outbreaks, particularly during the 16th and 17th centuries, authorities sometimes ordered cannon fire or the burning of gunpowder in the streets to clear the air. The logic was consistent with miasma theory. Smoke and shock waves might neutralize pestilential vapors. It didn't work. The real cause of the Black Death was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium spread primarily by fleas that lived on rats. The bacteria had no interest in bell vibrations or artillery blasts, but that doesn't mean these actions were irrational by the standards of the time. Church bells already held spiritual meaning. They were blessed. They marked death, prayer, danger, and divine presence. Many communities believed bells could ward off storms, demons, or evil spirits. Using them against plague fit within an existing worldview. Noise was not just medical, it was spiritual defense. There were disagreements, of course. Some people believed too much bell ringing might anger God. Others worried large gatherings to sing or pray might worsen contagion, though they did not understand why. Meanwhile, physicians turned to other air-based solutions. They burned aromatic woods and herbs in homes and streets. People carried pomanders filled with spices and flowers to mask foul smells. During later outbreaks, plague doctors wore long coats and the now famous beaked masks. The beaks were stuffed with herbs, rose petals, camphor, and vinegar-soaked sponges, all meant to filter or sweeten the air. Again, the target was miasma. Even into the 17th century, during outbreaks such as the Great Plague of London in 1665, gunpowder was burned in the streets and bonfires were lit in hopes of purifying the atmosphere. The theory persisted because germ theory would not emerge until the 19th century. When you don't know about bacteria, you build explanations from what you can observe. Bad smells often accompanied sickness, so smell became the enemy. And here's the human part. If your city is collapsing around you, if carts are carrying bodies past your door every morning, you want to act. Doing nothing feels unbearable. Ringing a bell, lighting a fire, firing a cannon, those are visible, physical acts. They create the feeling of resistance. Noise filled silence. It marked survival. It gave people something to do besides wait. Today we understand disease very differently. We know about pathogens, vectors, antibiotics, vaccines. We know that bells cannot scatter bacteria. But the impulse to make sound in crisis hasn't disappeared. People still gather, they still chant, they still bang pots from balconies during pandemics, they still create collective noise when they're afraid, grieving, or trying to show solidarity. So, if you ever hear an old church bell ringing across a foggy town square, remember this. Centuries ago, people believed that sound itself could hold death at bay. It couldn't. But for a moment, it made them feel less helpless. Do you know which English king was the only one to be executed? Charles I, the king who argued with Parliament until Parliament brought an axe. The king who believed in the divine right of kings until a revolution stood up and said, no. The monarch, whose reign ended not in exile, not in quiet disgrace, but on a public scaffold on a freezing January morning in 1649. This is the story of the king who lost everything, including his head. Charles I became king in 1625, inheriting the throne from his father, James I, the man associated with the King James Bible and a firm believer in royal authority. Charles inherited that belief in divine right, the idea that kings were chosen by God and answered to no earthly power. The problem was that England had a parliament, and Parliament expected to be consulted. Charles believed compromise was weakness. He clashed repeatedly with Parliament over money, religion, and foreign policy. He married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, which alarmed Protestant England. Rumours spread that he was soft on Catholicism, or worse, secretly sympathetic. Trust eroded quickly. Between 1629 and 1640, Charles ruled without calling Parliament at all. This period is known as the personal rule. His critics called it the 11 Years' Tyranny. Without Parliament, he still needed revenue, so he revived old taxes and legal loopholes. The most infamous was ship money, traditionally collected from coastal towns in wartime. Charles expanded it inland and in peacetime. People were not amused. When he tried to impose religious reforms on Scotland, rebellion broke out. Suddenly, he needed an army. And suddenly, he needed Parliament's money. He called Parliament back in 1640. It did not go well. Tensions escalated. Accusations flew. In 1642, Charles made the catastrophic decision to enter the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest 5 members of Parliament. They had already fled. The move was seen as an assault on parliamentary privilege. That same year, England descended into civil war. On one side were the royalists, known as Cavaliers. On the other were the parliamentarians, often called Roundheads. Families split, towns fortified. The conflict spread across England, Scotland, and Ireland in what we now call the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. At first, the outcome was uncertain. Then, Oliver Cromwell emerged as a formidable military leader. He helped build the new model army, disciplined, professional, and ideologically driven. Royalist strongholds began to fall. In 1646, Charles surrendered to Scottish forces, hoping to negotiate his way back into power. He played factions against each other, stalled for time, and secretly encouraged further uprisings. It backfired. After a second phase of civil war in 1648, Parliament had lost patience. The army purged moderate MPs in what became known as Pride's Purge. The remaining rump Parliament took an unprecedented step. They put the king on trial. In January 1649, Charles I stood accused of treason against his own people. The charge was radical. How could a king commit treason against his subjects? Charles refused to recognize the court's authority. He insisted that no lawful court could try a monarch. The court proceeded anyway. He was found guilty. The sentence was death. The shock wasn't that he had lost the war. Kings lost wars all the time. The shock was that an English king was to be executed by his own government, publicly, deliberately. On January 30th, 1649, a scaffold was erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. It was bitterly cold. Charles wore 2 shirts, so the cold would not make him shiver and appear afraid. He gave a brief speech, insisting he had always acted for the good of the kingdom and defending the divine right of kings. Then he laid his head on the block. The executioner, masked and anonymous, brought the axe down in a single blow. With that stroke, over 1,000 years of monarchy as England had known it came to a halt. The monarchy was abolished. The House of Lords was dissolved. England was declared a Commonwealth, effectively a republic. Oliver Cromwell eventually became Lord Protector, ruling with authority that looked, to some, suspiciously like monarchy in another form. But republics are fragile. After Cromwell's death in 1658, the political experiment faltered. In 1660, Charles's son was invited back. Charles II returned to London in triumph, and the monarchy was restored. Yet the memory of 1649 never disappeared. Royalists began referring to Charles I as a martyr. The Church of England even commemorated him for a time as King Charles the Martyr, honouring him on January 30th. Portraits depicted him serene and dignified, a king wronged by rebellion. Historians are less romantic. They see a ruler rigid in his beliefs, unwilling to compromise, convinced of his divine authority in a political world that was rapidly changing. Charles I remains the only English king to be executed after a formal trial. Not assassinated, not killed in battle, not quietly removed. Tried, sentenced, beheaded. A king brought down not by a foreign enemy, but by his own parliament. And ever since, every British monarch has ruled knowing one uncomfortable truth. The crown is powerful, but it is not untouchable. Do you know which nation used a sunstone as GPS? The Vikings get a lot of press for their axe-swinging, longboat-burning, monastery-raiding ways. But there's another side to these seafaring Norsemen that gets less attention. They were insanely good navigators, like cross the Atlantic in an open boat good. And according to some historians, along with a fair bit of scientific curiosity, they may have pulled it off using a crystal, a magical, semi-transparent, light-bending rock known as the sunstone. No, not the kind from your favourite fantasy novel. This is a real thing. A crystal with actual physics behind it. And it just might be the secret to how Vikings found the sun on cloudy days. It's around 1000 AD. GPS won't be invented for another 1,000 years. Compasses are still pretty unreliable in northern latitudes. Viking sailors are out there in open water, no land in sight, using the sun, the stars, the colour of the sea, and the flight paths of birds to steer their dragon-headed ships. But what do you do when the sky is a solid block of grey or the fog rolls in thicker than Odin's beard? That's where the sunstone comes in. Medieval Icelandic texts, such as the 13th century Raudolfsdatter, mention a special stone that could locate the sun even when it was hidden by clouds or twilight. The stone, when held up to the sky and rotated, would glow or brighten in a specific direction, pointing out where the sun was. For centuries, this was treated as folklore. A nice story, but come on, a magic rock that finds the sun? Then, science said, hold my horn of mead, and actually tested the idea. It turns out certain types of crystals, like Iceland spar, a transparent form of calcite, can polarize light. When sunlight hits Earth's atmosphere, it becomes polarized, especially near the horizon. Iceland spar can detect this polarization. When you rotate the crystal, a technique called double refraction splits the light into two rays. By observing the brightness difference between them, you can find the angle of polarization and with some practice, figure out where the sun is. In short, Viking sunglasses, but cooler. In 2011, researchers from Hungary and Sweden ran experiments using Iceland spar on overcast days and found it was surprisingly accurate at pinpointing the sun's location within a few degrees, more than enough for navigation. This theory got a major boost when archaeologists found an actual piece of Iceland spar aboard a 16th century shipwreck near Alderney in the English Channel. It wasn't Viking, but it suggested mariners were still using these crystals well after the compass was available. So yes, the Vikings may very well have been using sunstones to slice through fog and cloud cover like magical Norse lasers. Let's not forget that Viking voyages were no joke. They reached Greenland, Newfoundland, also known as Vinland, and possibly even further, all without charts, lighthouses, or weather apps. They read the sea like a living map, and if a chunk of sparkly rock helped them do that, even better. Of course, Sunstones weren't the only tools in the Viking navigation toolkit. They also used sun compasses, which relied on the sun's shadow to determine direction. Oral tradition played a huge part as well. Routes were memorized, landmarks were sung, and every seasoned sailor was basically a walking GPS with a beard. But the sunstone theory is just so perfectly Viking. It's practical, rugged, mysterious, and kind of magical. Exactly the sort of thing a Norse navigator would keep tucked in a leather pouch, ready to whip out the moment Thor decided to cover the sun with storm clouds. Do you know which king faked his death and slipped away into obscurity, leaving a porter's corpse in his place? Edward II, the king who may or may not have died in Berkeley Castle in 1327, the one whose enemies said he was murdered with a red-hot poker, the one whose death was so suspicious that, even centuries later, people aren't entirely sure he actually died. Yes, Edward II, history's most dramatic underachiever, may have pulled off the most medieval fake-out of all time. Edward II was never meant to be a medieval action figure. He was tall, handsome, and athletic, but he had little interest in politics or war. He liked music. He liked digging ditches with peasants. He liked Piers Gaveston, his best friend, probable lover, and source of endless royal scandal. He became king in 1307 after his father, Edward I, died while preparing to crush Scotland. Edward II was the opposite of his father. Where Edward I was strict and brutal, Edward II was laid back and baffling. He offended the nobility by elevating favourites. He lost to Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn, one of England's most humiliating defeats. He micromanaged trivial matters and ignored rebellions. His nobles muttered, his wife plotted, and eventually everything came crashing down. His wife, Isabella of France, started as a pawn in a political marriage, but ended up a medieval hurricane. She was intelligent, ambitious, and very done with Edward's nonsense. When he sidelined her and showered affection on Hugh Despenser, his new favourite, Isabella, went to France. But she didn't just leave. She returned with an army. Alongside her ally and lover, Roger Mortimer, she invaded England in 1326. Edward II's support collapsed like a bad tent. His own people turned on him. He fled. He was captured. He was forced to abdicate in favour of his son, Edward III, and he was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. Now, if this were a normal royal downfall, the next chapter would be about execution or a quiet death in captivity. But Edward II doesn't do normal. You may have heard the legend that Edward II was murdered in the dead of night by having a red-hot poker inserted into his body, the goal being to kill him without leaving visible marks. It's dramatic, it's horrifying, and it might be complete fiction. The story didn't appear until years later. No contemporary chronicler describes it. It reads more like a morality tale than a real event. And if someone were trying to kill a king discreetly, wouldn't stabbing him be less theatrical? Still, the official word went out in 1327 that Edward II was dead. His funeral was held. His son wore black. A body was buried. But something about it all felt off. Here's where it gets weird. Around 1337, a letter reached Edward III. It was long, detailed, and written by a Genoese priest named Manuele Fieschi, a papal notary and member of the influential Fieschi family, who later became Bishop of Vercelli. The document, now known as the Fieschi Letter, claimed that Edward II had not been murdered in 1327, but had escaped and spent the remainder of his life in exile in Europe. According to Fieschi, when the king heard he was to be killed at Berkeley Castle, he changed clothes with a servant. Using this disguise, he reached the gate and escaped, allegedly killing the gatekeeper in the process. He then fled to Corfe Castle, where he remained for 18 months. After that, he reportedly stayed in Ireland for 9 months, then crossed to the Low Countries and travelled to Italy, visiting the Pope at Avignon while passing through France. Edward was said to have lived the rest of his life in monastic hermitages near Milan in the Diocese of Pavia, possibly at the Abbey of Sant'Alberto di Butrio. Some dismissed the story as a hoax. Others weren't so sure. Edward III, intriguingly, did not publicly denounce the claim. Italian records mention a mysterious Englishman living in monastic secrecy. A bishop wrote of meeting a man who claimed to be the former King of England. He even reportedly received financial support. There was no social media to track someone's movements, no dental records to match a body. If Edward II had faked his death, it wouldn't have been impossible to get away with. What motive would he have had? Survival, for one. Humiliation, betrayal, and the risk of violent death made a quiet disappearance look pretty appealing, and if the alternative was red-hot poker justice, disappearing into a monastery sounds positively luxurious. Meanwhile, Isabella and Mortimer benefited greatly from his death. They had no interest in a living ex-king causing problems. Yet Edward III later executed Mortimer and sidelined his mother. Did he know the truth? Did he keep the secret? Historians have examined the royal tomb at Gloucester Cathedral, where Edward II is said to rest. The tomb was elaborate, quickly constructed and widely visited, but no one ever confirmed the identity of the corpse. Was it the porter, wrapped in royal robes and placed in the coffin while the real king slipped away under cover of darkness? We don't know. And maybe we're not supposed to. The legend of Edward II faking his death remains one of England's juiciest cold cases. It's not just about whether he died. It's about what people needed to believe. That justice was served, or that a wronged king survived. What we do know is that Edward II went from power to prison to dead in record time. That his death was politically convenient. That strange letters kept surfacing. And that even a century later, people were still whispering, was he really in that coffin? So maybe he died in that castle, tortured and alone, or maybe he slipped into the shadows, swapped identities with a porter, and lived out his days tending goats and rewriting psalms. Either way, Edward II gave us a royal mystery worthy of medieval noir. Edward II's reign was chaotic and disappointing. He lost battles, botched alliances, and nearly wrecked the monarchy. But his exit, that was unforgettable. Whether you believe in the porter swap or not, Edward's story reminds us that kings are people, vulnerable, paranoid, and sometimes desperate to disappear. He may have been a bad ruler, but he was a great escape artist. Or at least, he wanted to be remembered as one. Do you know which country once made tulips its most valuable commodity? Once upon a time, in the 1600s, the Netherlands lost its collective mind over a flower. Not gold, not oil, not even cheese. A flower, a tulip to be specific. And not just any tulip, some of them had stripes. Stripes, madness. This was tulip mania, the first recorded speculative bubble in economic history. A time when a single tulip bulb could cost more than a house, when fortunes were made, lost, and argued about for centuries. If you've ever looked at cryptocurrency, NFTs, or Beanie Babies and thought, this feels unsustainable, then congratulations. You understand the Dutch of 1637 better than you think. Tulips weren't native to the Netherlands. They came from the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, arriving in Europe in the late 1500s. By the early 1600s, they had reached the Netherlands, and the Dutch, already wealthy from global trade and developing a serious taste for luxury, fell head over wooden clogs in love. Tulips were exotic, rare, and unlike anything growing in Europe. Their vivid colours and symmetrical shapes made them status symbols. The rarer the variety, the more valuable the bulb. The rarest of all were the broken tulips, flowers with dramatic streaks and flame-like patterns caused by a mosaic virus. The Dutch didn't know that part. They simply thought the flowers were exceptionally beautiful and rare. Soon, tulips weren't just flowers. They were investments. Wealthy merchants, artisans, and even chimney sweeps started buying and selling bulbs, not to plant them, but to flip them for profit. It became so intense that people began trading tulip futures, contracts to buy bulbs at a later date. The actual flowers often never changed hands, only the promise of a flower did. And the prices were ridiculous. By 1636, a single bulb of a rare variety like the Semper Augustus could be worth more than a canal house in Amsterdam. Some records suggest people were trading ships, livestock, and entire estates for just a handful of bulbs. It was euphoria wrapped in petals. But bubbles, like tulips, don't last forever. In February 1637, at a routine tulip auction, no buyers showed up. One auctioneer tried to sell bulbs, no takers. Panic spread. People realized they were holding contracts for flowers no one wanted. Prices plummeted. Fortunes evaporated overnight. And just like that, the tulip bubble burst. What's wild is how quickly it all unraveled. In a matter of weeks, the market collapsed. People were left with worthless contracts. Legal chaos followed. Some buyers tried to cancel agreements. Sellers demanded payment. The government attempted to calm the situation with compromise policies. Historians still debate how many people were actually financially ruined, but the cultural impact was enormous. Tulip mania became shorthand for economic folly, a cautionary tale, a floral fever dream that economists, writers, and comedians have referenced for centuries. But here's the twist. The Dutch economy didn't actually collapse. The bubble burst, but the country kept trading, innovating, and growing wealthier. It was a lesson, not an apocalypse. And tulips? They stayed in fashion. The Netherlands still loves them, they just stopped mortgaging their houses to buy them. So, why did it happen? A few reasons. The Dutch had a booming economy and plenty of disposable income. The tulip market was largely unregulated. People love a get-rich-quick story, and everyone assumed someone else would always pay more later. Sound familiar? Whether it's real estate, .com stocks or cartoon apes on the blockchain, the psychology of a bubble rarely changes. Hope, hype, hysteria, and then pop. So next time you're tempted to spend your savings on a trending, can't-lose asset, remember the tulips. Beautiful, fragile, wildly overpriced. Do you know which nation believed that drinking the blood of a warrior could give you strength? In the grand arena of Roman medicine, there was no shortage of wild ideas. They burned herbs, examined urine, applied crushed beetles to wounds, and believed wombs could wander through the body. But perhaps the most dramatic, and definitely the most metal, was the belief that drinking gladiator blood could cure disease, especially epilepsy. Let's be clear. This wasn't some obscure village superstition. This was an accepted, if fringe, part of Roman society. The belief was simple, grotesque, and disturbingly logical in the Roman worldview. If you drank the blood of a powerful warrior, you might absorb some of his strength. And who better than a gladiator? Young, muscular, fearless, constantly battling death in front of thousands. If anyone had extraordinary power coursing through his veins, surely it was the man who had just fought for his life in the arena. Epilepsy was a major focus for this kind of cure. Known as the sacred disease, it terrified the Romans. Seizures were unpredictable, frightening, and deeply misunderstood. Without any real medical explanation, people assumed supernatural causes, curses, angry gods, or an imbalance in the body's mysterious humours. So, when medicine failed, Romans turned to spectacle. And there was no greater spectacle than the Colosseum. Imagine this. A gladiator falls in the dust, his last breath wheezing out into the roar of the crowd. As the body is dragged from the arena, spectators rush forward, not to mourn, not even to gawk, but to collect the blood. Some brought goblets, others soaked bread or cloth in it. Freshness was considered essential. The warmer the blood, the more powerful it was believed to be. The idea was that the soul was still present within the iron-rich fluid, ready to transfer its strength to a new vessel. There are even accounts of people with epilepsy being brought to the game specifically for this purpose. Parents desperate for a cure would bring their afflicted children and hope to obtain some of that precious gladiator essence. And this wasn't just rumour. Roman writers, such as Pliny the Elder, mentioned the practice. Physicians didn't universally endorse it, but they didn't always condemn it either. In a society where medicine, magic, and religion constantly blurred together, the practice occupied an uneasy middle ground. It wasn't limited to blood either. Gladiators' livers were also in demand. Some believed consuming the liver raw could enhance vitality or heal the mind. Others thought the heart, eaten quickly, could transfer courage. Yes, this all sounds like something from a myth or a horror film, but it was real. Roman medical texts contain numerous treatments involving animal parts, human fluids, and elaborate rituals. And remember, gladiators weren't just prisoners and slaves. They were also celebrities, ancient pop culture icons. Their sweat was collected and sold as a cosmetic skin treatment. Their blood was seen as a powerful healing substance. It wasn't just about health. It was about status. Drinking gladiator blood was gruesome, yes, but it also made you part of something elite, exclusive, and terrifyingly powerful. The practice likely peaked during the height of the gladiatorial games, when deaths were common and bodies plentiful. But as gladiatorial combat declined, due to changing tastes, Christian opposition, and a growing sense of public morality, so too did the consumption of gladiator blood. Eventually, the ritual faded. Sort of. In medieval Europe, the habit resurfaced in a new form. This time, it wasn't gladiators, but executed criminals. In places like Germany and France, crowds gathered at public executions with cups in hand. The freshly executed were seen as sources of healing blood, especially for epilepsy. Executioners were expected to cooperate, and in some places they were paid extra for providing it. In a darkly ironic twist, the blood of the condemned became a commodity. This bizarre idea that consuming part of another person could transfer their energy or cure illness has deep roots in human history. From Aztec rituals to early Chinese medicine, variations appear across cultures. Blood has long been seen as more than just a fluid. It has symbolized power, life, essence, and sacrifice. Today we look back on these practices with a mix of horror and curiosity. Our medical system may be sterile, clinical, and wrapped in paperwork, but it is also, thankfully, free from blood-drinking remedies. We've traded magical essence for molecules. But the desperation behind such beliefs is timeless. When someone you love is sick, when nothing else seems to work, people will try anything, even dipping bread in the blood of a fallen warrior. Do you know which king was struck by an arrow on a hunting trip? William II, also known as William Rufus, the red-faced, red-haired, red-tempered son of William the Conqueror. He ruled England from 1087 to 1100 and died in a way that has kept historians whispering ever since. Because when a king dies in the woods and the only witnesses vanish, people start asking questions. William Rufus was not what you'd call beloved. He inherited the English crown from his father, but not the charm. He was loud. He was blasphemous. He taxed the church heavily. He threw parties that scandalized everyone. Chroniclers called him rash, godless, and greedy. One even claimed his court was a place where no good could be learned and much evil was taught. He liked fighting. He liked power. He liked being feared. And he loved to hunt. On August 2nd, 1100, William went hunting in the New Forest. He was joined by a group of nobles, including Walter Tyrrell, a skilled archer and supposedly a loyal companion. It was meant to be just another royal hunt. Men on horseback, deer scattering, arrows flying, blood and laughter. But by the end of the day, the king would be dead. Accounts vary. Of course they do. The most common version goes like this. William spotted a deer. Walter Tyrrell drew his bow. The arrow missed its target and struck William squarely in the chest. He collapsed and died on the spot. Tyrrell, instead of calling for help, fled the scene, disappearing into the woods like a man who was not entirely shocked by how the day had turned out. The king's body was abandoned until local peasants retrieved it. It was thrown into a cart and carried back to Winchester, bleeding and lifeless. It was not a royal procession. It was closer to damage control. So, was it an accident? Some say yes. Hunting was dangerous. Accidents happened. Tyrrell's flight may have been panic rather than guilt. But others raised their eyebrows. William had enemies, plenty of them, including his own brother Henry. The same Henry who, by a remarkable coincidence, happened to be nearby and rode straight to Winchester to seize the royal treasury. Within days, Henry had declared himself king, crowned and ready. Fast work for someone supposedly caught off guard. And Tyrrell? He fled to France and lived comfortably for the rest of his life. No trial, no charges, just gone. The New Forest itself was no stranger to royal death. William Rufus's older brother Richard had also died there years earlier. Same forest, same family, same eerie silence. Some Saxons claimed the land was cursed, that the Norman kings had seized it, and the land was taking revenge. William Rufus was not buried in Westminster Abbey. Instead, he was laid to rest in Winchester Cathedral. His tomb remains there today, but no justice, no answers, only theories whispered among the trees. William Rufus was never mourned like a hero. He was widely disliked in life and quickly forgotten in death. His younger brother Henry took the crown and ruled with a tighter grip and more polished propaganda. But William's death left lingering questions. Why was there no real investigation? Why did Tyrrell flee if it was merely an accident? Why was Henry so ready to seize power? And perhaps most importantly, did anyone truly care? Because in the end, William Rufus wasn't the kind of king people missed. He was the kind they survived. Centuries later, historians still debate the truth. Murder or misfire? Conspiracy or chaos? No answer has ever been proven, no confession ever found. Just a red king in a green forest, felled by an arrow no one really wanted to claim. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it was justice, maybe it was both. Do you know which English king survived a catastrophic shipwreck because of explosive diarrhea? It was Stephen of Blois. Yes, that's Stephen. The one who sparked nearly 2 decades of civil war, known as the Anarchy, but who before all that royal chaos was simply a nobleman with very unfortunate digestion. Let's dive into the story of the king who couldn't hold it, and the illness that saved a throne. The year is 1120. King Henry I of England is wrapping up a family trip to Normandy. He plans to return to England with his court, including his only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, the golden boy of the Norman dynasty. The royal entourage is offered a magnificent new vessel called the White Ship, sleek, fast and packed with noble youths who believe themselves invincible. What could possibly go wrong? Alcohol, arrogance, and diarrhea. According to chroniclers of the time, the crew and passengers were drunk before they even left the harbour. It was essentially a noble booze cruise. But young Stephen of Blois, nephew of King Henry, decided not to board at the last minute. Not because he had a premonition, not because he objected to maritime partying, but because he had a severe stomach illness. Nature called violently, and Stephen stayed on land. That illness saved his life. Shortly after leaving port, the White Ship struck a submerged rock and sank. Nearly everyone on board drowned, including William Adelin. The English crown suddenly had no clear air. Stephen's stomach may have been a disaster, but it turned out to be historically strategic. Stephen of Blois was not first in line to the throne, nor second, third, or even 10th. But when Henry I died in 1135, the succession became deeply uncertain. Henry had made his barons swear to support his daughter, Empress Matilda, as queen. The barons were, let's say, less enthusiastic about that idea. While Matilda was in Normandy, Stephen rushed to England, gathered support, and had himself crowned king before anyone could object. Thus began Stephen's reign, a period so chaotic it makes modern political drama look positively orderly. Matilda was not about to let her cousin take the crown without a fight. She crossed the Channel, rallied supporters, and launched a rebellion. What followed was 19 years of civil war known as the Anarchy. Barons switched sides constantly. Towns were sacked and burned. Stephen was captured in 1141 and imprisoned. Matilda briefly declared herself Lady of the English, but never secured a formal coronation. At one point, Stephen was released in a prisoner exchange and resumed ruling as if nothing had happened. The medieval equivalent of pretending a disastrous mistake never occurred. Stephen's leadership style was generous, extremely generous. He granted castles and lands freely to secure loyalty. When supporters betrayed him anyway, he often responded with surprising leniency. Strategic consistency was not his greatest strength. Meanwhile, his nobles increasingly behaved like independent warlords. Still, Stephen had personal charm. He was not particularly cruel, which made him likeable, if not especially effective. His wife, also named Matilda, because history enjoys confusion, was Matilda of Boulogne, and she proved formidable. When Stephen was imprisoned, she governed in his name and even led military campaigns. While Stephen struggled to maintain control, his wife helped hold the kingdom together through determination and political skill. Eventually, everyone grew exhausted. Stephen's only surviving son, Eustace, died suddenly, clearing the path for a compromise. In 1153, Stephen agreed to recognise Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, as his heir. Stephen would remain king for life, and Henry would succeed him. Stephen died in 1154. Henry became Henry II, the king who married Eleanor of Aquitaine and later clashed dramatically with Thomas Becket. The drama, as always, continued. Stephen of Blois is not the most famous English king. He rarely appears in popular culture. Few people name their pets after him, but he played a crucial role in one of the most chaotic periods in English history, all because a sudden illness kept him off a doomed ship. So the next time you're unwell and wondering where your life went wrong, remember Stephen. That miserable night in 1120 changed the course of English history. Do you know which nation believed the brain was absolutely useless? If you had to pick the most important organ in your body, what would it be? Did you say the brain? That would make sense, unless you were an ancient Egyptian. To them, it wasn't the brain calling the shots. It was the heart. During mummification, embalmers carefully removed and preserved the internal organs, but the heart was left in place, not by mistake, but on purpose, reverently, because they believed the heart wasn't just pumping blood. It was responsible for thinking, feeling, remembering, and judging. The brain? That got scooped out and discarded like it didn't even matter. Your heart, yes, the organ that simply pumps blood, was considered your emotional archive, your conscience, and your logic centre. Meanwhile, the brain was seen as a squishy, useless filler. Some embalmers even removed it with hooks through the nose during mummification and threw it away like yesterday's leftovers. To be fair, the Egyptians were brilliant in many ways. Pioneers in medicine, astronomy, and architecture. But when it came to understanding the role of the brain, they were firmly committed to the idea that the heart did all the mental heavy lifting. In ancient Egyptian belief, the heart was not just a vital organ, it was your spiritual fingerprint. It stored your memories, your emotions, your thoughts, and most importantly, your deeds. This wasn't just philosophical symbolism, it had real consequences, especially in the afterlife. Enter the famous weighing of the heart ceremony. When you died, the god Anubis, jackal-headed, imposing, and unmistakable, would take your heart and place it on a scale. On the other side sat a feather, but not just any feather, the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. If your heart was heavier than the feather, it meant you had lived a life filled with lies, cruelty, or wrongdoing. Your heart would be devoured by a terrifying creature named Ammit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, a nightmare designed for maximum finality. Game over. But if your heart was light and pure, you were granted entry to the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise, endless abundance, perfect harvests, and eternal peace. This belief made the heart sacred. It was the only organ that had to remain inside the body during mummification. The rest were carefully preserved in canopic jars, the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. But the heart stayed in place. Or at least that was the plan. If the heart was damaged or missing, embalmers would insert a stone scarab amulet engraved with magical spells to serve as a substitute. Imagine valuing the heart's spiritual importance so much that you carried a backup version into eternity. But here's the puzzling part. The Egyptians understood a great deal about the human body. They performed basic surgery, set broken bones, stitched wounds, and practiced dentistry. They had practical knowledge of anatomy from treating injuries and from the mummification process itself. Yet the brain was still seen as useless. Why? Probably because of how it appears. The brain doesn't visibly move or show obvious activity. The heart, on the other hand, is dynamic. It pounds when you're afraid. It races when you're excited. It stops when you die. To ancient observers, it clearly seemed to be in charge. The earliest medical texts we possess, such as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, written around 1600 BCE but based on much older knowledge, contain detailed descriptions of head injuries. They even describe cerebrospinal fluid, yet there is no indication that the Egyptians connected the brain with thought or emotion. It was simply there, an organ with no clear purpose. And this reminds us of something important. Every culture gets things wrong. The Victorians used arsenic in wallpaper. Medieval Europeans believed bad smells caused disease, and the ancient Egyptians, for all their pyramids and medical innovations, considered the brain about as important as the spleen. Still, their heart-centered philosophy influenced later traditions. The heart as a symbol of love, emotion, and truth did not begin with Valentine's Day cards. It has deep roots in Egyptian belief and was echoed by later cultures, including the Greeks and early Christians. Even today, we say things like follow your heart, learn by heart, or he had a good heart, as if the fist-sized muscle in our chest is running the show. So, next time you feel your heart pounding with emotion, remember that the Egyptians saw that as proof of its importance. They believed the heart was your true self, the seat of your soul, a living record of every joy, every mistake, every act of kindness or cruelty. And when they imagined your final judgment, it wasn't sins written in a book. It was your heart, weighed on a scale against a feather by a jackal-headed god. Do you know who was the youngest king of England? Henry VI. He was crowned at just 9 months old. That's not a metaphor. That's a baby with a crown. This is the story of the king who got the throne before he got teeth. Henry VI was born on December 6th, 1421, the only child of King Henry V of England and Catherine of Valois. His father, Henry V, was a celebrated war hero and national icon, renowned for his military success, particularly at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. England regarded him as the embodiment of medieval kingship, fierce, competent, and inspirational. But all of that came to an abrupt end. Less than a year after Henry VI's birth, his father died suddenly of dysentery while campaigning in France in August 1422. The infant Henry, not yet a year old, became King of England. It was a political and logistical nightmare. A nation reeling from the loss of its greatest warrior king now found itself ruled by a baby who could not sit up, form words, or comprehend the weight of the crown placed upon his head. To complicate matters further, thanks to the Treaty of Troyes signed in 1420 during his father's reign, Henry was recognised as the heir to the French throne. Upon the death of his grandfather, Charles VI of France, in October 1422, the young Henry was proclaimed King of France by the English and their allies. Thus, before his first birthday, Henry VI held claims to both the English and French crowns. On parchment, a dual monarchy looked impressive. In reality, it was deeply unstable. Large parts of France refused to accept an English infant as king, and the 100 Years' War continued with renewed intensity. Henry was far too young to understand the chaos swirling around him. Regents and protectors were appointed to govern in his stead, including his uncles, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and John, Duke of Bedford. Each had their own ambitions, priorities, and rivalries. Political manoeuvring intensified as powerful noble families sought influence over the child monarch. In practice, the kingdom was ruled by council, and unity was rare. As Henry grew older and gradually assumed personal rule in the 1430s and 1440s, it became clear that he was very different from his father. He was gentle, pious, and deeply introspective. He had little taste for violence or political confrontation. Unlike his father, he was not suited to battlefield command or forceful governance. In another life, Henry might have thrived as a scholar or a churchman. Instead, he was expected to manage an ongoing continental war and a fractious nobility at home. His gentle nature was ill-suited to the turbulent times. His reluctance to assert authority allowed factional tensions at court to deepen. As England's fortunes in France declined and territory was gradually lost, criticism of his leadership increased. He was not widely hated. He was widely seen as ineffective. By the mid-15th century, the political balance was collapsing. In 1453, after the catastrophic English defeat at the Battle of Castillon effectively ended the 100 Years' War, Henry suffered a severe mental breakdown. He became unresponsive and unable to rule for more than a year. During this period, his queen, Margaret of Anjou, attempted to defend the Lancastrian cause, while Richard, Duke of York, was appointed Lord Protector. The king's incapacity intensified existing rivalries and helped ignite the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic civil war between the House of Lancaster, to which Henry belonged, and the rival House of York. The remainder of Henry VI's life was marked by deposition, exile, imprisonment, and brief restoration. In 1461, he was overthrown by Edward IV of the House of York. In 1470, he was briefly restored to the throne during a rebellion against Edward, only to be deposed again in 1471 after the Yorkist victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Soon after, Henry was imprisoned in the Tower of London. He died there on May 21st, 1471, under suspicious circumstances. Most historians believe he was murdered, likely on the orders of Edward IV, who saw the deposed king as a continuing threat. Henry VI remains the youngest person ever to ascend the English throne, yet his reign is remembered not for triumph or reform, but for instability, territorial loss, civil war, and personal tragedy. He was a king unsuited to the age into which he was born. Crowned too young, burdened with impossible expectations, and broken by forces beyond his control, Henry VI stands as a reminder that a crown can be both a privilege and a terrible weight. Do you know what was one of the most popular remedies during medieval times? Leeches. If you ever feel like your doctor's treatment plan is a little strange, just be thankful they're not reaching for a jar of leeches. Because for hundreds of years in Europe, that was completely normal. Bleeding was big business. If you weren't slicing someone open with a lancet, you were probably slapping a blood-sucking worm on their skin and calling it a cure. Welcome to the slimy world of medieval and early modern medicine, where leeches weren't just unpleasant, they were some of medicine's most trusted tools. To understand why people believed in leeching, we have to go back to humoral theory. This dominant medical idea, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, lasted well into the 19th century. It held that the body was governed by 4 fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If those humours fell out of balance, illness followed. Fever, too much blood. Sluggishness, possibly excess phlegm. Mood swings, maybe black bile. The logic varied, but the solution was often the same: remove blood. Bloodletting by knife or lancet was common, but it could be messy and risky. That's where leeches came in. They were seen as a gentler alternative, portable, reusable, less likely to cause catastrophic bleeding if applied carefully. The species most commonly used was Hirudo medicinalis, the European medicinal leech. These creatures have 3 jaws lined with tiny teeth. When they attach, they secrete saliva containing anticoagulants, such as hirudin, which prevent clotting, along with mild anesthetics and vasodilators that increase blood flow. In other words, they are biologically equipped to draw blood efficiently and quietly. By the 17th and especially the 18th and early 19th centuries, leeches had become medical essentials across Europe. Apothecaries stocked them in jars. Doctors carried them in small containers. France, in particular, used them on an enormous scale. In the 1830s, French hospitals reportedly consumed millions of leeches per year, and shortages became a real economic concern. Leeches were prescribed for headaches, fevers, inflammation, high blood pressure, menstrual disorders, mental illness, and infections. They were placed behind the ears, on the temples, inside the mouth, and on inflamed tissues. Few areas of the body were considered off-limits if bloodletting seemed appropriate. One of the most influential advocates of heavy bloodletting was the French physician François-Joseph Victor Broussais. In the early 19th century, he argued that most diseases stemmed from inflammation of internal organs, particularly the gastrointestinal tract. His treatment of choice was aggressive leeching to reduce that inflammation. His ideas became so fashionable that historians sometimes describe the period as one of leech mania in France. Patients could have dozens of leeches applied in a single session. Many left pale and weak. Some suffered serious complications from excessive blood loss. This enthusiasm was not limited to France. Across Europe, leeches were part of mainstream medical practice. In Britain, they were widely used by both physicians and surgeons. In Russia and parts of the Ottoman Empire, they were also standard treatment for a range of conditions. As you might expect, outcomes were mixed. In some cases, excessive bloodletting weakened patients significantly. One often cited example is George Washington. In 1799, during a severe throat infection, his physicians removed a large quantity of blood through repeated bleedings over the course of a single day. He died shortly afterward. While historians debate how much the blood loss contributed, the treatment certainly did not help. By the late 19th century, medicine began to change dramatically. Microscopes improved. Germ theory, advanced by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, reshaped understanding of disease. Antiseptic techniques, anesthesia, and vaccination transformed medical practice. As scientific medicine advanced, routine bloodletting fell out of favour. Leeches gradually became symbols of outdated medical thinking. And yet, they were not entirely useless. Modern medicine still uses medicinal leeches in specific carefully controlled situations, particularly in microsurgery and reconstructive surgery. When surgeons reattach fingers, ears, or skin flaps, arterial blood flow can sometimes be restored more easily than venous drainage. Blood may enter the tissue but struggle to leave, causing dangerous congestion. In these cases, a leech can help. By drawing off excess blood and releasing anticoagulants, it promotes circulation while new veins form. In the United States, medicinal leeches are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration as medical devices. They are raised in sterile conditions, used once, and then safely disposed of. No shared jars, no dusty shelves, no casual reuse. So, in a strange way, the leech has come full circle. Once praised as a cure for nearly everything, later mocked as a relic of bad medicine, it now holds a small but legitimate place in modern surgical practice. Medicine changes. What seems obvious in one century can look misguided in the next. And occasionally, something once dismissed crawls quietly back into the operating room, not as a miracle cure, but as a carefully used tool that still has a purpose. Do you know which nation wore dogs up their sleeves? Yes, I'm serious. If you think carrying a chihuahua in a designer handbag is a modern trend, let me introduce you to the emperors and empresses of Imperial China, who took it one step further and literally wore their dogs. Yes, centuries before small dogs became fashion accessories on reality TV, Chinese royal courts were breeding tiny lapdogs not just for companionship, but to live inside the wide, flowing sleeves of traditional robes. These dogs were warm, loyal, and perfectly pocket-sized. Living, breathing status symbols. Today, they're often referred to as sleeve dogs. They were especially favoured during the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907, and later in the Ming, 1368 to 1644, and Qing, 1644 to 1912 dynasties, though the practice likely developed gradually over centuries. Breeds associated with this tradition include the Pekingese, the Shih Tzu, and the closely related Tibetan Spaniel. All were bred to be small, alert, and composed enough to be carried close to the body without fuss. Let's talk about the Pekingese. Named after Peking, the former Western name for Beijing, the Pekingese became one of the most prized palace breeds. According to legend, the breed was created when the Buddha shrank a lion down to dog size so it could follow him. Whether taken literally or not, the story reflects how highly these dogs were regarded. They were not simply pets. They were symbolic creatures associated with lions, which in Chinese culture represented protection and imperial power. Within the Forbidden City, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, palace dogs were carefully bred and managed. They had dedicated caretakers, elaborate grooming routines, and sometimes ceremonial names. Harming or stealing an imperial dog could bring severe punishment. While stories of automatic execution may be exaggerated, their protection was taken very seriously. These dogs were bred not only for size, but for temperament. A proper sleeved dog needed to be calm, dignified, and affectionate. Barking during a formal audience or snapping at silk robes would not have been tolerated. They were expected to behave as elegantly as the nobles who carried them. There was also a practical element. In the colder months, the unheated stone halls of large palace complexes could be chilly. The voluminous sleeves of traditional robes made it possible to tuck a small dog inside, where it provided warmth for the hands. A discreet paw or tuft of fur peeking out was also a subtle display of refinement and status. One of the most famous dog-loving rulers was Empress Dowager Cixi of the Qing dynasty. She ruled as the power behind the throne in the late 19th century and was devoted to her Pekingese. Portraits show her seated with her dogs nearby, treated almost like tiny courtiers. Historical accounts describe special quarters for the palace dogs, embroidered garments, and dedicated staff to care for them. When some of her favourite dogs died, they were reportedly given elaborate burials within the palace grounds. Sleeve dogs were not limited to empresses. Emperors and high-ranking officials also kept them. Far from being considered frivolous, these small dogs symbolized proximity to the imperial household and elite status. Ownership was tightly controlled, especially within the palace. For much of their history, these breeds were largely confined to the imperial court. That changed dramatically in 1860 during the Second Opium War. When British and French forces looted the old summer palace in Beijing, several Pekingese dogs were found inside. A few were taken to Britain. One was presented to Queen Victoria, who named it Luti. This marked the beginning of the breed's spread into Europe. From there, the Pekingese, and later, the Shih Tzu, gained popularity among European aristocracy and wealthy households. Their flat faces, flowing coats, short legs, and confident, almost regal demeanour made them stand out. Even as breeding standards evolved, the association with luxury and exclusivity remained. Today, when you see a small dog riding in a stroller, wearing a bow tie, or starring in its own social media account, it might seem like a modern indulgence. But the tradition of elevating tiny dogs to near royal status is centuries old. Once, in palaces of silk and stone, these dogs were not accessories. They were protected, pampered, and woven into court life itself. So next time you see a tiny, fluffy companion being treated like royalty, think of the sleeve dogs. Think of hidden paws inside embroidered sleeves, quiet palace corridors, and rulers who carried warmth and status tucked gently against their wrists. Do you know which English king believed he could heal his people just by touching them? Edward III. That's right. The warrior king, the 100 Years' War king, the father of the Black Prince. He wasn't just a battlefield legend with an impressive family tree. He was also one of many English monarchs who practiced the royal touch, the belief that a king could heal the sick through divinely appointed hands. Specifically, he claimed the ability to cure scrofula, a disease often called the king's evil. The idea that kings had healing powers did not begin with Edward III. It can be traced back to earlier medieval rulers, especially in France and England. By the 14th century, the belief was firmly established. The king was seen as God's chosen ruler. If God had appointed him, surely he must possess some special grace, perhaps even the power to cure disease. Scrofula, the illness most commonly associated with the royal touch, was a form of tuberculosis that affected the lymph nodes, particularly in the neck. It caused swollen glands, abscesses, and sometimes open sores. It could linger for years. There was no effective medical treatment at the time. Enter Edward III, combining sacred ritual with royal spectacle. The royal touch was not casual. It was a ceremony. The sick would prepare themselves, sometimes fasting beforehand. Clergy were present. Prayers were read. The king would touch the afflicted person, often making the sign of the cross. In many cases, he would also present a small coin or medallion known as a touch piece, usually worn around the neck. Did it cure tuberculosis? No. But belief, especially in a deeply religious society, carried enormous weight. Edward III ruled from 1327 to 1377, a reign of 50 years marked by war, plague, and political upheaval. Early in his rule, he removed the influence of his mother, Isabella of France, and her ally, Roger Mortimer. He then launched what became known as the 100 Years' War, asserting a claim to the French crown. Victories at battles such as Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, cemented his reputation as a formidable warrior king. His son, Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince, became famous in his own right. But ruling in the 14th century required more than military strength. It required symbolism. The royal touch reinforced the idea that the king was sacred. A ruler who could heal with his hands was not merely a political leader. He was divinely sanctioned. Imagine being a medieval peasant with a painful swelling in your neck. There are no antibiotics. Medical knowledge is limited. You hear that the king is nearby and that he can cure the king's evil. You travel, you wait, you pray. Then the king, dressed in splendor, surrounded by clergy and court, places his hand upon you during a solemn ritual. Even if the disease remained, the experience itself was powerful. You were seen. You were blessed. You were touched by God's anointed ruler. It was medicine wrapped in monarchy. Edward III helped solidify the royal touch as a central feature of English kingship. His successors continued the practice for centuries. It survived the late medieval period, the Tudor dynasty, and even into the Stuart era. Charles II, for example, is said to have touched tens of thousands of people during his reign. By then, the ceremony was as much political theatre as spiritual act. Edward's own life did not end in triumph. His later years were marked by decline. The Black Death devastated England during his reign. His beloved son, the Black Prince, died in 1376, a year before Edward himself. Court politics grew more unstable, and the aging king became increasingly frail. When Edward III died in 1377, he could not heal his kingdom's future uncertainty. He could not touch away plague, factionalism, or mortality. He could not heal himself. Yet the belief in the king's healing power endured long after his death. The royal touch continued well into the 18th century, long after scientific thinking had begun to challenge such ideas. In the end, it was never really about curing scrofula. It was about power, about faith, about reinforcing the idea that the person wearing the crown stood closer to heaven than everyone else. Edward III did not have magic hands, but he understood the power of ritual, image, and belief, and in the medieval world, that could be just as potent. Do you know which English king was the first to actually speak English as his primary language? Henry IV, the man who usurped the throne, founded the Lancastrian dynasty, and became the first king of England since the Norman conquest to grow up speaking English as his mother tongue. It took more than 300 years after 1066 for an English monarch to naturally speak the language of the marketplace, the streets, and the taverns. When William the Conqueror seized the throne in 1066, he brought more than a new ruling dynasty. He brought Norman French. For centuries afterward, the English monarchy operated largely in French and Latin. French was the language of court, law, diplomacy, and aristocratic life. Latin dominated official records and the church. English survived mainly among the common people. Kings ruled England, but many did not speak English fluently, especially in the generations immediately after the conquest. It was not considered a language of prestige. It was viewed as rustic, local, and socially inferior. Over time, however, things shifted. By the 14th century, English was resurging. The Black Death had disrupted social hierarchies. The 100 Years' War fostered a stronger sense of English identity, partly in opposition to France. English began reappearing in literature, most famously in the works of Geoffrey Chaucer. Enter Henry IV. Born in 1367, he was the son of John of Gaunt and the grandson of Edward III. He belonged to the house of Plantagenet, but he did not inherit the throne peacefully. In 1399, Henry led a revolt against his cousin, King Richard II. Richard was deposed and later died in captivity, probably in Pontefract Castle. Henry then claimed the crown as Henry IV, beginning the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenet dynasty. Unlike the Norman and early Plantagenet kings, Henry IV grew up in England in a society where English was widely spoken again among the nobility. He was the first king since before 1066 whose native language was English. That matters. In 1399, at his coronation, Henry addressed Parliament in English. While English had been gradually returning to administrative use before his reign, his public use of the language carried symbolic weight. It signalled that English was no longer merely the language of peasants. It was acceptable at the highest level of power. This was not just cultural evolution, it was political strategy. Henry's claim to the throne was not straightforward. He had seized it by force. His legitimacy rested on shaky ground. To strengthen his position, he needed broad support, especially from Parliament and the English political nation. By speaking English, he aligned himself more closely with his subjects. He reduced the sense of distance between crown and country. Language became a tool of consolidation. After Henry IV, English continued to gain ground. By the reign of his son, Henry V, it was firmly established in government correspondence. In 1417, English began to be used regularly in royal administrative records for the first time since the conquest. Latin remained important in legal documents, and French did not disappear overnight, but the shift was clear. English was now the language of kings. Henry IV's reign itself was far from peaceful. He faced repeated rebellions, including uprisings led by the Percy family and resistance in Wales under Owain Glyndwr. His rule was marked by political instability and recurring illness. He spent much of his reign defending the crown he had taken, yet he held it. And his son, Henry V, would go on to win fame at the Battle of Agincourt, reinforcing a distinctly English royal identity. So when Henry IV stood before Parliament in 1399 and spoke in English, it was more than a practical choice. It was a declaration. This king, however controversial his rise, was rooted in the land he ruled. It's difficult to imagine now that an English king speaking English was once noteworthy, but for centuries, language had created a barrier between ruler and ruled. Henry IV helped break that barrier. From his reign onward, the English crown would never again sound quite so foreign.